see the clerk's memo at pages 324 and 326. You'll see IMTAC's taxis, written evidence and position paper. So we are welcoming members of IMTAC today to our committee.
There you go.
Do you need your iPad?
Yes, please. Maybe.
There you are.
Thank you.
Hello.
Good morning.
Morning. Welcome to the committee today. You're all very, very welcome. I must say I am very excited to see Clyde. I think I've met Clyde before at another event. No offence to the rest that have joined today, but certainly Clyde has already become one of my favourite attendees to the committee meetings so far. So Clyde's up there. So, but we're welcoming June Best and Clyde, the guide dog. June, you are Vice Chair of IMTAC. We have Michael Lorimer, you're Secretary of IMTAC, and we have Dermot Devlin, IMTAC member and convener of People, Streets and Places Working Group IMTAC. So you're very, very welcome to the committee today. And just while Clyde gets a wee drink there, I'm just seeking agreement from members that the evidence today is recorded by Hansard. All content with that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we do have some written evidence that you have provided to the committee, and we thank you for that. And I'm going to give you a brief sort of 5-10 minutes just to introduce yourselves and talk about the issues in relation to taxi provision. I'm very keen to come to members' questions as well on this issue. So I'll let you give us your brief opening statement, please.
Thank you. Could I ask, because I can't see anybody, do you mind doing introductions around the table, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd be very grateful.
Absolutely. So we'll go to my right-hand side, Cahill.
On this side, Carol Boylan, Sinn Féin MLA for Newry and Armagh, member of the committee.
Peter McReynolds, Alliance MLA for East Belfast.
Andrew McMurray, Alliance MLA for South Down.
I'm Deborah Erskine. I'm chairperson of the committee.
Stephen Dunn, MLA, DUP, North Down.
Thank you. So that's everybody that's in the room, and then we have on screen joining us is Danny Baker, who's also a member of the committee today. So hopefully that will help, June.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for giving us the opportunity to come today and to give you some facts about taxis. And taxis are really, really important for deaf, disabled people and older people on many counts, but usually it's a personal service, it's a door-to-door service, and it also is convenient because there may not be transport, other public transport available when you can order a taxi if you've got to go to appointments or work or employment. But transport covers every aspect of our lives, whether it's social, whether it's work, whether it's leisure, whether it's education or health, and we all need transport. It's not in, isolation. We don't work in isolation. It has to be. Transport is so important for everyone, and the taxis are really, really important for disabled people for the reasons I've mentioned there, the time and the place. Maybe there's no other connectivity to the big transport links or the bus or the train. And everybody's been aware of the new Grand Central Station and opening, and although it's got its problems and we will be sorting that out, the biggie for that is the taxis, because they are extremely important in the inclusion for disabled people and older people. As well as that, I have to say that way back in 2008 there was the Taxis Act, and the Taxis Act was to look and make taxi services more available and inclusive for disabled people, deaf people and older people. And I'm afraid that the Taxi Act, which was meant to improve services, actually it didn't do that in many ways. And we not only had feedback from the taxi drivers, who kicked back actually from the taxi drivers who were so concerned about the fact that there were licensing rules, that they were taxi vehicles, and importantly the WAVs, which are wheelchair accessible vehicles. So there were a lot of things. There's more than that, and I'm not going to go into everything today because we're just going to have Michael and Dermot speaking very shortly. But the other thing was that things have got worse. During the pandemic, it was absolutely terrible for all of us. But for many people who were deaf, disabled or older people, they couldn't access taxis because of the limited services that there were. And the results of that were that many taxi firms, and particularly in rural areas where I'm coming from, went out of business or decided to retire after COVID. And it's just been so much, I'm trying to think of the word, so much has been lost, if you like, with the will of taxi drivers and the attitudes of taxi drivers, and the cost of living has exacerbated that big time cost of living crisis. So things have been very dire, and it's meant that a lot of people who would be dependent on taxis, and taxis are part of that inclusive travel system for connectivity, and it just means that it's not happening. And things have got really, really worse with the cost of living, as we all know. And it doesn't matter whether it's the city areas or the rural areas. Dermot's going to tell you a wee bit about rural areas as well. But it is very, very deflating to know that some people cannot get wheelchair accessible vehicles to go about their day-to-day business. And it's all about choice, having choice, individual choice like everybody else. And it just seems that we need to look at how we can change with government, how we can change this lack of transport that is pivotal for our day-to-day lives. So I'm going to hand over to Dermot. Please, Dermot.
Thank you.
Thank you, June. I'm from a rural area. I'm from Fermanagh, Omagh District Council. I'm just going to highlight some of the issues that deaf, disabled and older people face from trying to get accessible taxis. As June iterated just a short while ago, there's not as many on the roads now as there would have been due to the impact of COVID and other factors as well, such as drivers coming to retirement age and not enough people to replace them for various issues, which Michael will be highlighting at a later date. But it does leave myself, who is disabled, having to rely on other people, having to rely on taxis, having to rely on public transport, which doesn't work, particularly in rural areas, and having to rely on family members. You sort of have to take in their time into account as well. So it is quite difficult. So as June said, having an accessible taxi, and I need a WAB taxi, which is a wheelchair accessible vehicle, it's important to connect us through public transport, to connect us going to hospitals, but also connect us to having a social life as well. Because as disabled people, we do have social lives, but that seems to be forgotten about because a lot of us don't get taxis after 6 o'clock. And why is the reason of that? Because there's no drivers. Do they think that disabled people don't have social lives? So, as myself, a disabled person, since the beginning of the year, I haven't had a good night out in 9 months, you know, in my area.
Neither have I, Dermot.
But I mean, if I wanted a night out and rely on a taxi, I'd have to go elsewhere, you know, for example, Belfast.
Yeah.
And even that creates its difficulties, because I was in Belfast quite recently and I wanted to pre-book, because when you're disabled, you know, you don't trust, you don't have the luxury of being spontaneous, going, I want to get a bus now, I want to get a taxi now. So I wanted to pre-book it, so I went on to a taxi company, well, 2 taxi companies' website to pre-book one, and you have a whole list of cars and everything you need, but nothing for accessibility. So I contacted them saying that there's no accessibility. He said, we took that off the website, you have to do it through the phone. It was quite frustrating. So I booked it about 4 months in advance, 4 weeks in advance to get one. And then at the end, what I like to do is reiterate everything I say it, so that they know what I booked. But they must have heard me at the start and didn't realise that I was a wheelchair user. Got a wee bit frustrated me that I didn't mention that, even though that it was. But it told me that wheelchair users can only book 2 days in advance, unlike non-disabled people who can book so much in advance. And even then, it's so difficult to get one, because every disabled person knows we've got a small window, 3 hours, so I couldn't get a taxi. So I had to look around and find one that was independent, that could take me on my run. But even the main ones were like, we don't do it after this time, because again, as I said, the perception out there is disabled people don't have social lives. But as I said from the beginning, I'm from the rural part of the country, you know, from Ananoma, which is where you're from as well, and you know what it's like to try and get a taxi there. It's very, very difficult, particularly when you live outside the main towns like Enniskillen and Omagh. You know, I'm from Greencastle, so it's incredibly difficult to get one to come out that distance. Particularly if you're a wheelchair user, because there is so few on the ground. And the ones that are doing it, they are pre-booked to do hospital runs, which is totally acceptable, because those are the runs that need to be doing. But it just highlights that the gap in taxis in rural areas, because they're so busy taking disabled people, older people to the hospitals, that they can't do the other runs, like taking people to work, taking people to go shopping, taking people to visit family and friends. So that's the great issue I would have in the rural areas. But say you have a friend that lives in a completely rural area, it's someone might say, why don't you take public transport? Because they might drop you off somewhere and you'd have a mile or 2 walk to get to them. So it's things like that where taxis are increasingly important for deaf and disabled people, because without that we are resigned to our own homes. We're resigned to doing things online, you know, shopping online, because you know, we want to support the local economy, but we can't do that. We can't get out to the local economy. We have to stay at home and shop in places like Amazon and things like that, which I'd rather not do. So these are some of the big issues when it comes to rural transport and wheelchair using taxis and stuff like that. But we also need to look at because you're a wheelchair user, we do seem to be penalised on top of not being able to get the taxi. When we do get a taxi, we seem to be charged more, because it takes more time to get us into the vehicle, secure us into the vehicle. So the fact that we are disabled, incredibly difficult to get a taxi, and then when we are, we have that extra financial burden of going somewhere, whether it's time and a half or whatever it may be, depending on the taxi company you use, and depending if you build up a good relationship with them. So as deaf and disabled people, you know, we're living in time of society. We don't have the luxury to spend money here, there and everywhere, and we can't get public transport, so we're relying on taxis. and we're paying more than we should do on top of that as well. So that's really the big issue that I would have as a disabled person who is a wheelchair user, who needs but can't use taxi services, particularly in rural area. Okay, I'll hand you back to Jean now.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say and back up what Dermot's saying there about refusals. As you know, I'm a guide dog owner, and I have had many experiences, as have other assistance dog owners, of still having refusals, even though that the Taxi Act covered the fact that it should be, it is legal to refuse. But there are no prosecutions that I know of, and I've looked up extensively for that. And that in itself, I have to tell you that I moved into a village out of a rural area for the very simple that I was spending an absolute fortune on taxi fares. No matter where I wanted to go, I had to get to the train station. There was school buses in the day, but that was it, one there and one back. So again, I needed the taxis and the availability, because taxis take contracts, so they have airport runs, and there's lots more than this, but airport runs and school runs, which make, this cost of living crisis where, taxis are trying to make a living, there's fewer of them. And that means that they're all trying to get more money, regular money, through contracts. And therefore, I can't get to an appointment at near 2:30, say, to the Lagan Valley Hospital, for the simple reason that the taxis are out bringing children home from school. So that's also a problem. But I will tell you about an experience that I've had with taxis. There was one taxi driver was called. He came to pick me up. I was at a conference in a hotel in Belfast, and he came, and I have to be honest and say I've never been so affronted. First of all, he was going to take the dog, and I pointed out that he couldn't refuse the dog except on grounds of medical considerations, etc. And so when he realised that he was going to have to take the dog, he went to the boot of the car, said, "Stay there a minute." And he brought out a really, really old, like curtain kind of material. And I thought he was going to put it on the floor, but he put it on the chair as well for me to wrap around me and the dog. Now, that is not acceptable. And I did explain to the company, and I got an apology from the company, and I was told that driver would be getting in touch with me. But that's only, that didn't happen. Again, there's no, if you like, nobody policing it or taking it any further. And there are all sorts of incidents like that. For example, I had ordered a taxi to pick me up at Lisburn Leisure Centre, and I came outside with a friend, and the taxi was ordered, took one look at me, she said, and at the dog, and whizzed, was slowing up to pick me up and just put the foot in the accelerator. Now, that's stopping me doing things that I like. And there's many, many people like me, and it's stopping us doing the things that we would like to do. Mm-hmm. And there's no transport, there's no direct transport from where I was living in the country into Lisburn. So I needed that taxi. And it's just very sad that there are fewer taxis. Cost of living is making, either a cost of fuel is putting the prices up, and the taxis, are struggling as well from their point of view. So I'm just going to hand over to Michael, because I could go on and write a book about this.
Thank you, June. It's Deborah here, and certainly from the committee's perspective, we're really keen to sort of unpack some of those issues. So, Michael, if you could briefly just point to some
just very quickly, I suppose members all have a copy of the paper that we republished last year. We published it first in 2008 following on from the Taxis Act being passed. June says there are clearly issues with the Taxis Act in terms of how it's been implemented. Lots of the regulations weren't introduced till 8 years after the legislation was actually passed, when the taxi industry had significantly changed. But for instance, we know that one of the key aims of the Taxis Act was increase the provision of wheelchair accessible vehicles. That has clearly not worked. There are other factors like COVID and cost of living involved in that. But for instance, we are looking at, for instance, suggesting that we strengthen regulation, link wheelchair accessible provision to operator licensing rather than ranks. We are suggesting that disabled people's rights are strengthened in terms of both the refusal of people with assistance dogs, but also wheelchair users as well. There's legislation that enables all this to happen. We are also suggesting that that we support the taxi industry, because in a lot of cases we are talking about individual drivers or small companies here who we've got to recognise that there is a financial element to this, and that we don't offer the taxi trade as a government much in the way of subsidy or support. So there's a range of things we could do in terms of supporting the industry to provide more accessible services, including direct subsidy to buy accessible vehicles, for instance. But we should also be looking at involving the taxi trade in the wider provision of services that government run. You know, for instance, we have the Rural Transport Fund, we have things like the Transport Programme for People with Disabilities. What role could taxis play in delivering those services as well? And the other thing we're looking at doing is to, government uses an awful lot, and I know there was a lot of coverage recently in the media around health service and how much money it spends on taxis. What are we asking in return for spending that money? Surely in terms of contracting and things like that, we can expect higher standards from the taxi trade in return for the money that government is already investing in them. So those are some of the ideas that are coming through. Just to say that we did a piece of work before the pandemic with the department around a survey of older and disabled people, and I think we had nearly 1,000 people responded to that survey. So taxis is a huge issue for older and disabled people. We have never seen the results of that survey. Okay, 2018, things were different then, but it would have given us a very clear picture on how disabled people were finding it. And I suppose I was shared, the headline that was coming across was things had got worse since the passage of the regulations that came in 2016.
Thank you. We really appreciate and I suppose the human aspect and the human cost has been very well put across today in relation to how important having taxi provision is for yourselves and the difficulties that you have even if you get a taxi. And you know, June, you just described a very upsetting incident that had happened yourself, but and I think the point is, the sad reality is that's not unique. And it's certainly something that we want to try and, you know, even today from this committee send out a message, you know, that I'm assuming that there will be people that will be tuned into the committee meeting today, but certainly even in our conversations going forward that decent humanity, I suppose, can be put across to people as well in relation to how they act and interact with members of the public. We do want to come to some questions just a bit more specifically in relation to the regulations, and I just wanted to scope out, if I could, in relation to, you know, what further information on the proposal to link the provision of wheelchair accessible taxis to operator licensing. What proportion should be wheelchair accessible taxis in your view, and do you think that this should be targeted to specific areas? I mean, Dermot, you talked about the rural area and we know very well what that is like, and especially from your point of view as well. So if you could just give a wee bit more information in terms of numbers and what you think is needed in terms of proportions.
I hand that over to you, Michael.
Yeah, I suppose it's obviously anything like this has to be linked to the size of the operation in terms of the, you know, and I suppose we are largely talking in terms of the main benefits being in urban areas where you have the large taxi companies. So it does leave that element here in terms of how do we improve rural access to taxis, and I suppose that's where we're probably more focused on the subsidy element and government supporting rural taxi companies. But certainly the larger operators, and again, it's quite complicated, and I know some people around the table here have been involved in these conversations. I'm not looking at Cahill in particular for many, many years. It's quite complicated in terms of the way operations are set up and the employment status of drivers and things like that. But certainly the larger Belfast firms should be required to provide a certain provision of wheelchair accessible taxis as part of their operator licensing, and then it would be a sliding scale in terms of the size of various operations, you know. So but I say it does leave that question hanging there about how do we do it with small rural operators here, maybe one person or a small number of drivers.
Do you have a proportion, you know, what would be your ask in terms of a proportion, like a figure in terms of that wheelchair accessible taxis when you're looking at the urban element there?
I suppose it's difficult to say in terms of that because of the getting a clear idea on the size of fleets and things like that. But certainly it is something that we could look at in terms of developing something that means that the operator provides a level of service that disabled people can rely on, because currently they can't. You know, it's a matter of, Dermot said, phoning and being told there's no services available. We know there are vehicles out there, but they are just never available when wheelchair users need them. The other thing we do need to tackle too is the public hire situation in Belfast, or the Class A situation and the Class B situation, because of the, you know, there are serious issues with accessibility of those vehicles too, and the availability of them too. You know, we had a case a couple of years ago of a wheelchair user coming to Belfast and being refused by every single black cab operator or driver that he approached. So there are issues there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
That need to be addressed too, because on paper in Belfast there are an awful lot of accessible vehicles, but they are never available when disabled people need them.
In terms of Class B licences and you know, the estimated need to meet demand, how does Northern Ireland compare to other jurisdictions? Where is doing it well? Where's a case of best practice?
Yes.
I suppose we're part, I suppose, of a group of, we have a liaison committee that works across the UK with our advisory bodies from Scotland and England and Wales. So I would say in a sense that there's nowhere doing things particularly well. That some of the issues we face are faced by disabled people across the country. There are obviously places that have a better provision of accessible, for want of again, using the old term in terms of a public hire fleet. You know, if you're in London, you've got more access to wheelchair accessible. Some of the major cities like Manchester, Edinburgh have modern accessible black cab fleets. That's not to say that there aren't issues with those in terms of the cost and things, but they tend to be more easily available than we have here.
Can I just
Yes,
say as well,
of course.
sorry, that there are some of the different companies are trying out things like vouchers for deaf and disabled people, and what's the other one, Michael? There was another one.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing is in terms of the subsidy, some of the local authorities, you know, for instance in London, you've got the London taxi card scheme that offers subsidised trips on wheelchair accessible vehicles too. So that's another way that government could, in terms of encouraging taxi companies to invest in accessible services as well.
Thank you. Just to say, the door, you will obviously hear the door is opening and closing. It's just to let you know that is some of our Hansard staff just changing position when we're in the midst of our evidence session. So that's why you'll hear the door opening and closing there. I also wanted to scope out, just before I come to some other members, just in relation to education and taxi provision for children and young people, and your views in relation to that, because obviously they will obviously need accessible taxi provision, and I just wanted to scope out how difficult it is perhaps to be able to access taxi provision in the likes of the morning or the evening, school pick-up, drop-off times, because no doubt members of your own have to get to jobs as well, and it's not about a hierarchy, but it's just I would imagine that is creating pressure on the system as well.
Absolutely. I'm from an education background, and we have created in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, you know, a reliability of getting children who are deaf or disabled, to get them to school. And actually, we're quite isolating them as well. But there's what was the amount of money, Michael, we had in our report? We have written a report and an updated report as well, and I think it was millions, hasn't it, are being spent on travel.
Yeah.
I need to check that up, but it would be on taxi travel. And yes, of course, that, you know, there could be, if you like, inclusion on the buses that are already out there as well. But yes, the taxis, that's what I was saying, the taxis take contracts for schools and so forth, and that means that you can't get out and about at all when they're using school runs. As I can tell you from bitter experience and so forth. But the taxis are used. I know parents in my rural area, the parents had got together to hire a taxi to bring a few children to school together, because it seemed nonsensical that one member of the family who was deaf or disabled, had an impairment or difficulties, they were taken to school on the taxi, but the rest of the family had to wait on the school bus. So that's what we have here. I don't know how extensive it is, and maybe that's something that we could look at. There was looking at combining transport. It's all of what I call the inclusive transport system. That, you know, those taxis are really, really important within that. So I hope I've answered your question.
No, thank you very much. I'm going to come to members. I'm going to introduce them. So we have Cahill first.
Carl Boylan, the Sinn Féin MLA for Newry and Armagh. You are very welcome and thanks very much. Dermot, if I hadn't known you had a night out, I could have invited you up to Armagh to celebrate us winning the Sam O'Bar. Unfortunately, I could have sent you a bus, could have sent you the county bus. But no, Megan, you mentioned, I mean, I've been a long time at it, and I mean, the intention of the Act was about operator licence and everything else. And I'm not going to rehash the story. What I am slightly disappointed is there was good intention to try and bring things forward. And looking at it now, before we get to a couple of questions, and maybe to get to the crux of what we need to try and do as a committee, we try to facilitate as best we can. But COVID has played a big part. I know Red Cross industry, not just the taxi industry, but I'm being a rural representative. I've seen changes myself, and you're relying on personal friends and people, you know, who understand the situation in each area. But for my point here, and I mean, I was looking at some of the stuff you put in. I mean, realistically for yourself, and I know the chair asked about a B-class taxi and everything else. Realistic, probably one in terms of you're talking there maybe strengthen regulations. But before we go to that, I mean, the point for me is you're a strong organisation, but this takes a conversation right across the board in terms of all the departments. You know, you need health appointments, or you need to go over here. And I know that you talked about the nighttime economy. Maybe a chamber of commerce or local authorities need to have that broader conversation as well. If we're serious about tackling where we want to go forward, but specifically for ourselves, and you said strengthen the regulations. I mean, it's not just about saying, you know, maybe it is about saying bringing a new regulation in or strengthen what's in the legislation. Well, what's your views on that, or what's the thinking behind you saying strengthen the legislation or the regulations?
I think that the issue, I think, Cal, is that, you know, even before the pandemic, we were getting the feedback from disabled people that things had not improved. In fact, they were going backwards. So, and again, it would be really good to have that research in the public domain so we could see it. You know, it is a snapshot in time. So it was saying to us that the department had placed, in terms of WAV provision, had placed a lot of eggs in the basket of we link it to rank provision. And that clearly wasn't working. So even back then we were pushing the department to look again at that. And there are powers within the Taxis Act that they can use. There's powers within the DDA that they can use to strengthen regulations. They're not a magic wand. They won't solve everything, but it is basically looking at strengthening the right of disabled people to have access to the vehicle that suits them best. So I say there is the power in the Taxis Act to link the WAV provision to operator licensing, in addition to the rank stuff, that linked to rank, and I think that's something we would be keen for the department to look at. It probably will be very unpopular with the taxi trade, and you know we've had this issue all throughout that, and again, we're really sympathetic that the taxi trade is not like a homogeneous group. There's lots of different elements in it, and we have to respect the fact that there'd be different solutions for different areas, but we do really need to focus in on how we can actually increase the numbers of WAVs that are available to people, and that is one way. Regulation is one way. It's not the only way. We are saying very clearly as well that government needs to do more to financially support the industry to improve accessibility as well.
No, and I appreciate that, and I don't make any apology for saying this, but I mean, we have a responsibility to facilitate everybody. And when we bring regulations in, the regulations should facilitate everyone. So it's not, I appreciate those may be difficult conversations, but that's conversations, you're here to talk to us. So as legislators, we have a responsibility to have a conversation with that. My point is, I mean, you know, you've heard this expression, and I've used it this morning, this carrot and stick approach. And I mean, it's a wee element of both, because there also needs to be an enforcement side of it. You mentioned June where your problems there where nobody, you know, you didn't get an opportunity to respond or anything else, and that's the enforcement side of things wasn't there. But if we're serious about going forward and addressing some of the issues, it's a new challenge for us. But like I said, most of the questions being asked and most of the conversations we've had already are based on some of the questions we had. For myself and as a member of the committee, certainly I have no issue in bringing forward your conversations. There are a few things you've suggested there, and if it is something that we need to look at in terms of, and there will be people listening in, we have to bring everybody in round the table again and have that conversation, and so be it. I mean, I listened this morning on the radio about the new challenges over in the centre, about having to cross the road behind the new station there. So there's a few things as Riz has had there recently. So I'm prepared to have the conversation, but just really commentary. Thanks very much for coming in and presenting those. We'll have your written papers, so we'll chat as a committee and see what way. Obviously, we'll talk to the chair and see what way we're prepared to go. But thank you for your evidence. Okay.
Thank you, Cahill. I'm now going to introduce Andrew.
Hello, yep, Andrew McMurray, Alliance, MLA. No, just reading through some of the notes and just on the back of some of what you said, and thank you for sharing, because I mean you weren't sharing nice pleasant experiences, unfortunately, so no, do appreciate that. I suppose one point is about talking about ensuring inclusive, accessible complaint mechanisms are available. Who would and what would be the best, like, you know, who would regulate that? Who would administer that? Is that something you see? Would it be the taxi operators? Is there taxi operators governing, or is that something that you know, given the DFI essentially give the licenses, would that something you expect the DFI to manage, if that makes sense? And I do have another question, but if you want,
We'll take that question first,
Perfect.
if that's
Yep.
okay.
Yep.
Well, ultimately, it's the department that are responsible to issue the licence, and complaints should ultimately land with the department. But I suppose in every complaint process, I suppose the companies themselves should have a complaint process that people, a clear and transparent complaint process that people use. And if there's no resolution, then the department should have a much more enhanced complaint handling role than they do now.
Okay, and then that's sort of glad you said that. Really,
Proactive rather than enhanced, because they have
Yeah.
the powers at the minute to do it.
Yeah.
It's difficult to use.
Can I just say, Andrew, that there's an awful lot of people who have had bad experiences and refusals, etc., etc. I'm only one of them, and I have to say that it's really worrying that, you know, those complaints that we have, we phone the taxi company, blah de blah, and nothing happens. And that's where we need to have a system, a clear system, you know, whether it's a refusal for guide dogs, and, you know, you either do that yourself or you go back to guide dogs, or, you know, to see how many refusals that they have had, and hearing dogs for the deaf and emotional support dogs. But you know, there's quite a lot. Even when we were coming in today, it was quite funny. This is just an anecdote. When we were coming in today, the security guy at the gate said, "Oh, you have a dog in the back of the car. You can't take that into Stormont. You can't take that into Stormont." And I says, "He's a guide dog." So
Yeah.
okay. I don't know how I mean, per Clyde, how could you refer to Clyde? Like, you know what I mean? Cheaper.
No, if you ask the next question to Clyde there on the
I'm finding it very hard watching him there.
I just see the wee nose come up with the table there, and that's. But I am a dog person, so that's all right. The next question was just, at what stage do you think? Education of the taxi drivers or the taxi bodies plays a part? I mean, I'm thinking that, you know, from my previous job, I would have driven minibuses, and there's a whole pile of CPD things. I mean, is this subject brought up in CPDs? Is that something that should be? I mean, if it is, it doesn't necessarily. Or what would your thought?
I suppose we've been involved in, obviously, developing training programs and things like that alongside the department. We've also run a number of awareness campaigns around the law and things like that, particularly around carriage of assistance dogs. The law's been in place for 20 odd years, but we haven't had any prosecutions, which tells its own story. If there's legislation there that makes it unlawful to do something, but there's no ultimate sanction, then the legislation is not really worth the paper it's written on. So we've run the campaigns, we've put together training courses. The training courses cover all these issues. The drivers have to, and I know the drivers, some of the drivers, you know, find the training quite a burden to have to do, but they have to do it. And they have to do an element that includes disability awareness, quality training. So the provision is there, so we've done that work, and the messages have gone out to people within the trade, but we're still coming up against these issues around discrimination. That's why we're saying let's use things like the DDA to the maximum.
Okay, Andrew.
Yep, thank you.
Peter, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you everybody for coming in. Peter McReynolds, Alliance MLA for East Belfast. My two queries is, firstly, what has the engagement been like with the taxi lobby on a number of the points that you've raised today? I think they were in it with us a number of months ago, I think it was, and I know there's challenges that they're experiencing. So has there been much engagement with them directly, and how has that been?
I suppose, yeah, there has been. Yeah, we've met with quite a few representatives from different parts of the taxi trade. Again, very much being clear that there isn't one voice within the taxi trade here, which is, again, it's not unusual, but it makes life more difficult because there are different opinions. So we've had the conversations with all, and I suppose the key message we want to say is we want to work with the folk from the taxi trade, but there needs to be an understanding that from our perspective we need to see positive change that means disabled people have the same access to services as others, and that will mean some difficult issues for the taxi trade to consult to deal with. But the other thing is we're trying to say in our paper here is that the taxi trade does need support. It's not fair to expect them just simply to invest in hugely expensive vehicles without any expectation of getting a return on that investment. So there is a need for government to look again at how we can support the taxi trade to respond to what we want. So it can't just be done with regulation and making it harder, because what will happen is people will drift away from providing a service. And it's been hard enough. I say the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, you've heard it from the trade, we've heard it from the trade, it's driving away people from actually working in the taxi trade, and that's making it worse for everyone, but particularly for deaf and disabled people in terms of accessing services.
And secondly and lastly, Chair, we actually have the Minister in front of us as a committee next week. Is there anything that you would like us to raise with him directly that he could take back to his officials?
I think that would be an amazing opportunity, just to put the points that we're putting across today, but asking for, legislation to perhaps make wheelchair WAVs, wheelchair accessible vehicles, mandatory, the way guide dogs, guide dogs, you can't have refusals. So it's actually saying that you can't refuse a wheelchair on your vehicle as long as it is a WAV. And of course, WAVs are very expensive. And it's these incentives like the voucher card or like the other cards. But it's really up to the department and government, isn't it?
I think the key message now, obviously we've met with Minister as well. We're hopefully going to meet him again shortly around our annual report. Taxis have been top of our priority list for about 10 years. And the Minister's well aware of that. It's about, we're aware as well we're within a shortened mandate, so it's what can be done within that, realistically within the shortened mandate. And I suppose it's really starting those discussions again around, because the taxi trade aren't happy, we're not happy. How can we start those discussions again, how we tackle these issues? And that, taking the points that I've made, that is about a conversation between all of us, really, and not just simply us having a position. This we need to start that conversation again. I think if the Minister was to restart the discussions between all the key stakeholders, that would be a real step forward.
Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Stephen?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, folks, for your excellent presentation and coming in, and just commend you on your work campaigning as well. And Michael, it's good to put a face to your name. You've sent many emails over many years, and I've seen your name for quite a while, so it's good to connect with you properly. But I know we've touched on quite a lot of the issues around taxis, so I'll not rehearse those, but we do very much appreciate the challenges, and it's good to hear it from yourselves. Just in terms of the wider question, I know it's probably a separate, broader issue which would probably take another hour, but just you touched upon it briefly in terms of the public transport, and your connections with TransLink and your engagements and so on. And obviously, they're investing in a lot in terms of the new station. You touched upon it very briefly, but just even the experience maybe from the three of you, in terms of as a user, do you feel they could be doing more, and so on?
Do you want to say that about your experiences?
I'm just making it didn't get the question, sorry.
Sorry, I maybe talked too fast, but just about your experience with TransLink as a user. Do you think it's improved?
Well, I can only speak as my experiences coming from a rural area.
Yeah.
As public transport, say for example, if I want to go to Belfast or Dublin, for example, I have to use the Gold Liner. We have like the platform that they take up above. I find that extremely nerve-wracking to use as a wheelchair user, because you basically taking you feel very unsafe when you're going up there, because once you get up you have to drive on the bus, and there's just a very, very narrow space to get your wheelchair into and turned around. A narrow space where you could actually make one slight move and the wheelchair could come out and you could fall a great height. And I know from other wheelchair users as well, through IMTAC and speaking to other people out in the public as well, that they would have the same face I do, because we do feel like we're taking our own lives into harm by doing that, and we do think that the low floor should be the one that TransLink is procuring going forward, because it's a lot easier to get into.
Yes.
But as a wheelchair user, like I have friends who are wheelchair users, I have family who's a wheelchair user, but I can only travel on my own. The other wheelchair users cannot come with me because there's not enough space for more than one wheelchair to get onto the bus. So if we were going to Belfast for the day, we'd have to travel separately up the 273, which is almost a 2-hour journey. So I'd have to wait for them to come, or they'd have to wait for me to come. So it's not a great system. Plus, we're continuing with TransLink to to make sure that they make the right purchases for buses. And even as a wheelchair user, there's other issues as well. That we'll come across. The audio visual display that they're not across the network yet, so we don't know. Some people need advance notice that they're coming up to a train station, or they're coming up to a bus stop. So somebody with visual or hearing impairment or sensory difficulties, they need advance notice so they can be ready to get off the bus, so they could miss that stop. So reality is where there's a lot of difficulties in the bigger cities, in the bigger towns, but when you come into rural from Hannah and Oma, those difficulties are multiplied yet again, the same as this for the taxi services.
I just add maybe we've spent an awful lot of time building relationships with TransLink up to, Chris Conway's coming to our IMTAC meeting next week and to answer questions and so we've spent a lot of time building those relationships with people at senior levels in TransLink. I think as well, I got to acknowledge that the past two ministers, both John O'Dowd and Nicola Mallon, have been excellent in terms of holding TransLink to account for the public money that they're given and requiring them to deliver on accessibility. So we're starting to see the fruits of that come through, both building those relationships and the department and ministers basically saying to TransLink, you need to deliver more for the money you're getting in terms of accessibility. We had a meeting yesterday about bus procurement, and we're heading in the right direction in terms of tackling some of the issues that Dermot has talked about. I think the big problem obviously with, particularly when we're investing in things like buses and infrastructure, once you've spent the money, it's really difficult to go back and fix certain things. Say a bus, you're stuck with a bus for 8 to 10 years, a new station's 30. So really that message is starting to drop, that we need to make sure that when we're spending the money, we spend it as well as we possibly can and make it as inclusive and accessible to everyone. So, and again, there's credit due on TransLink's side, but also on the department side as well for being much more robust with TransLink than they have perhaps been in the past. Hopefully that message will get through from today as well.
Thank you.
Stephen, is that
No,
you?
thank you.
You're
Yeah,
happy
that's
enough?
been nice.
I just wanted to pick up just on a point in relation to the legislation and refusals of. I take it that refusals are being reported, because there's no prosecution. So, but I take it they are being reported by.
Well, it depends, to be honest. As far as I'm concerned, if there's a refusal, or if I'm refused, then I will let people know about it, and I'll certainly phone the taxi company, etc. But that's the end of it, really. And there's no process of taking that forward.
Right.
As we said earlier, that it needs to be, we need to look at that. There's nobody policing, but some of the service organisations like guide dogs, like MenCap, etc., would have maybe more statistics on how many refusals and where they were. But individuals, it's up to individuals, and it's like everything else. A lot of people, if they have a really bad experience, honestly, they won't go out again. That's the truth. And that is the shame about this, and this is where taxis is. And you were asking about buses and trains, other forms of public transport. My dog, Clyde, is quite big, and he finds it very, very difficult and uncomfortable to be in buses and coaches. And I'm usually asked to walk to the back if it's a coach, etc. at the door, and it's not always the nicest place to be, etc. And therefore I use taxis to get to the station where I am. And trains are much easier for me to use. to have the space for him and comfort for him.
Yeah, thank you. It's certainly something that we can look into to try and find out in terms of those refusals and enforcements, because nobody should be refused, public transport, at all. And in terms of taxi, I include taxi provision in relation to that public transport element. Members, are you content? Any further questions?
Just one point. I mean, it's important to log and have them all called in. See all the complaints. Those issues need to be recorded, no matter who it is. I would advise that. Just a final point, because I see here there's other schemes across the water that, and I do think we need to support the taxi industry in this here as well. It's not just a case of let's bait people with a big stick and that's right. We need to encourage them to. Now, I know there's regulation, a certain percentage should have been. I'm not arguing that, but we have a new conversation starting today on behalf of yourselves, and let's have that. But that scheme across the water or elsewhere where there's a scheme that works well in some other jurisdiction might be able to be replicated here. And obviously you've made reference to some, but I will certainly follow up with that on your behalf. Okay.
Super. Thank you. Look, I'm very conscious that ironically we're talking about transport provision, and we've asked you to come up to the committee today and go through all those challenges today in getting up to Stormont. So we deeply, deeply appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to go through those challenges today to get up to Stormont. And if you don't mind, I would really like to say bye to Clyde before he goes. So, look, thank you for your evidence today. It is a really serious issue and something that we do we want to try and find where the solutions are in relation to it. So we do appreciate it, and I'm now going to just go and say bye to Clyde, if that's okay, before he leaves.
Thank you very much, all of you, for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. That's good.
There's an event.
Just waiting on a date to come through.
I've said that you need to come because I can't reach your dog.
Some off the private office. We're trying to get a date.
I'm going to bring my kids up in 115, so people should be just bringing their dogs. I'm excited for it. I think it's Tuesday or Wednesday.
Thank you for bringing my dog.
St. Bernard, big St. Bernard.
No, that's the half cost, half Bernese.